Welcome guys. So what we're going to look at today is how can you learn most things you need to know about photography in less than 10 minutes. Let's jump right into it. The discussion today is going to be mostly about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I'm sure as somebody who's interested in photography, you've heard of these things so many times. But today we're going to demystify them completely. So by the end of this video, you'll know everything you need to know. What is so important about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO? Well, these three aspects of photography make up how your camera captures an image by means of light. So let's look at each individual aspect and we're going to break them down so that it is really easy for you to understand. So let's look at aperture. When looking at your camera, you will find your aperture adjustment as a dial or a wheel. That dial will adjust the size of your aperture, and that is measured in f-stops. What that aperture dial does is it opens the aperture blades of your lens in a way that it lets in more or less light. Think of a tap. If you've got a tap which you open up, the wider you open up the tap, the more water comes out. The same is with your aperture dial. If you open the aperture dial more, you'll let in more light, which hits the sensor and therefore having a brighter image. The inverse is also true. You close the tap, less water comes out. Close the aperture dial, less light will be hitting your sensor. Each of those elements of aperture, when adjusting them, will also impact the creative elements of your photography by means of depth of field. Now, the word depth of field is actually less complex than it sounds, but we'll demystify that in another tutorial. Circling back to aperture, we will be looking at two other elements that also impact the way your camera captures light. So that is shutter speed and ISO. What is shutter speed? Well, shutter speed, as it sounds, is quite a simple concept. Your camera has either a mechanical or an electronic or a combination of those two shutters. A mechanical shutter is an actual moving part in the camera that closes off the sensor to light, whereas an electronic shutter completely desensitizes the sensor without using any mechanical components. So the rate at which this shutter covers the sensor or prevents the sensor from capturing light is referred to as shutter speed. The faster it closes, or the faster that it opens and closes, will determine how much light gets let in. Again, think of a tap. The longer you have the tap open, the more water is going to come out. The same goes for shutter speed. The longer your shutter is open, the more light's going to hit your sensor, therefore making your image brighter. The same can be said for a fast shutter speed. The quicker that shutter closes, the less time that you have that tap open, the less light is going to be hitting your sensor. And lastly, we have ISO. ISO is simply the sensitivity of your sensor to light. So the higher your ISO, the more sensitive your camera is to light. Now, there are a couple of advantages and disadvantages to a high ISO. Let's say you bump up your ISO really high. It'll allow you to take photos in really dark environments because your sensor is a lot more sensitive to light. But at the same time, you'll be introducing more noise into your image. And noise can be seen as little specks or particles that look like grains of sand. These kind of can ruin your image a bit if you're shooting at a really high ISO. But modern editing software has made it really easy to actually remove noise from your image. And some AI technologies have gotten really clever at doing so in a non-destructive way that you almost don't notice that there was any noise ever in this image. So you've got shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. All three of these elements determine how your camera captures light. How do you use them together? Well, first of all, let's look at ISO. Because our ISO is the sensitivity of our sensor, it is usually the first setting we want to dial in before we take any photos. The reason for this is it has the highest impact on the actual quality of our image, whether we want a really crisp, noiseless image, or whether we don't mind there being a bit of noise. And for example, if we're shooting at night, we will need to use a higher ISO. So that is a bit out of our control. Once we've dialed in our ISO settings, we will then determine the creative elements of our image. Do we want to see some movement or some blur in our photos? Then perhaps we'd want to use shutter speed as our main element and maybe use a slower shutter speed. Or do we want a really crisp image? Well, then we'll need to use a high shutter speed. And therefore we might look at your aperture more and preset our shutter speed. What a camera allows us to do is it allows us to shoot on manual settings. Manual settings allow us to completely control all three elements independently: our ISO, our aperture, and our shutter speed. So we are able to, depending on the situation, decide which of these elements we want to focus on. Obviously, we will have different creative elements that require different focus points. If we're shooting portraiture, weddings, we might be more interested in the aperture because we might want a shallower depth of field to capture a specific moment, to put focus on a specific aspect of the image. Or maybe we're shooting sports photography and it's really important to have a crisp shot with no motion blur. There we might make sure that our shutter speed is fast enough in order to capture a crisp image. By focusing on one of these settings, we will then adjust the other two to compensate in order for us to get a well-exposed image. Now, this can sometimes take some time to get used to, and really it takes practice. There's no one quick way of seeing which settings you have to use together in which situations. Often it's about experimenting and using your camera. But something we will do in the future is have a practical tutorial on how we will approach different scenarios and how I go about adjusting the aperture, ISO, and shutter speed for each situation. This will make it really practical for you and give you a bit of a head start when you're practicing on your own scenarios, whether it be for your work or whether it's just for your hobbies. So that is a basic rundown of the three elements that comprise 80% of everything you need to know in photography. But what about the other 20%? Well, don't worry. We're going to be diving into those in the next few weeks, and we're going to really demystify everything about photography. So if you want to learn more, stick around, like and subscribe, it really helps our channel. And make sure you watch the next tutorial that is going to help you jump your photography to the next level. Cheers, guys.